Let's do one more word with Yossi Klein Halevi, who is the author most recently of Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation. We sit here in October 2013, which is 40 years to the month that the Yom Kippur War happened in Israel, which was, I guess it's fair to say, the most traumatic war out of all the wars in Israel's history. You looked like you were going to lose that one. And I want to go fast forward because a lot of the mindset, I gather, between what was happening back then still exists today as it relates to what to do about Iran. 40 years ago, Golda Meir made a decision not to launch a preemptive strike against your Arab neighbors, lest the United States would be upset. Is the same calculation in place today?
Well, very much so. I think that the ghost of Prime Minister Golda Meir is haunting the current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And his predicament is, should he trust the United States, especially in light of these new negotiations with Iran, which most Israelis regard as a deception and an attempt by Iran to simply buy time. And the dilemma that Israel is facing is that its window in terms of its capability, military capability to attack Iran is closing. Israel has limited ability to strike Iran and to set back its nuclear process. And so if these negotiations continue 6 months, 8 months, a year, Israel will have lost its first strike ability. That means that on an issue that Israel has identified as existential, stopping a nuclear Iran, it will have lost its ability to protect itself. And it will have in effect ceded its self-defense to the United States. And here the crucial question becomes, can Israel trust President Obama's resolve on Iran? When he says, I've got a red line on Iran, is his red line on Iran more serious than his red line was on Syria?
How do you answer the question?
I think that Obama's wavering on a strike against a genocidal regime in Syria, I would call it an auto-genocidal regime, because Assad has brought a new innovation in the terrible history of genocide, which is genocide against your own people. And in Syria, you have a convergence of Western political interests, which is to stop to defeat a pro-Iranian regime, and on the other hand, a strong interest to affirm human rights principles and to stop a regime from mass murdering its own people. And yet Obama blinked. And if he blinked on what was such a straightforward issue over enforcing his own red line, he's the one who defined use of chemical weapons as a red line. And not only does Assad, a two-bit dictator who is fighting for his life, defy the American president, but he gets away with it. And I think that has very damaging consequences for American power and for the trust that Israelis place in Obama's resolve, and not only Israelis. The same doubts are being raised in the Arab world.
Much of the world seems very intrigued by the Iranian charm offensive of their new president. Are you?
No. I think that what I fear we're seeing is on the one hand an Iranian deception, and on the other hand a Western exhaustion and desperation, and that's a very dangerous combination. Now, there are two main obstacles to Iran achieving nuclear capability. One are the increasingly crippling sanctions that the international community has imposed on Iran, or part of the international community. And the second is the ongoing threat of an Israeli military strike. By engaging in prolonged negotiations, Iran is trying to neutralize both of these threats. First of all, the longer the negotiations go on, the less capable Israel is going to be to launch an effective strike. And Iran is hoping to reach an agreement that will allow it to maintain much of its enriched uranium, and it will close certain facilities. It may even stop further enrichment, but to continue to hold on to 20% enrichment, which would give it a nuclear bomb is achieved at 99% enrichment of uranium. Iran now has a substantial arsenal of 20% enriched uranium, and unless Iran ships that enriched uranium out, if it continues to hold it, it can decide at any moment when it can reach nuclear breakout. And the concern in Israel is that an agreement will be reached that will allow Iran to maintain part of its enriched uranium in exchange for a freeze on further enrichment. From an Israeli point of view, that is a disastrous agreement.
Let me ask you one more thing about this, though, because there are obviously a lot of things to worry about. One of the things people tell me they're worried about, some people tell me they're worried about, is if Israel were to launch a strike, what kind of holy hell would rain down on Israel's head by Iran, Hezbollah, others?
Look, I think there are many worrying potential consequences of a military strike against Iran. One is what you've just cited. There are tens of thousands of missiles aimed at Tel Aviv. Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. And so the Israeli home front is very vulnerable. There's a fear of Iran activating sleeper cells, terrorist cells around the world. There are fears of economic consequences. But the counter argument to that is if Iran goes nuclear, there is no return. We will then be in a new era in which political blackmail will become the norm. Iran will now be untouchable. Think of North Korea. And there are two models of countries that were trying to go nuclear. There is Libya and there's North Korea. Libya was stripped of its nuclear capabilities.
Voluntarily gave them up?
Voluntarily gave them up after the American invasion of Iraq. And Gaddafi, the former dictator in Libya, was afraid that he would be next. And that was a consequence of American power. And we often forget that when we talk about the Iraq war as a failure. We forget about Libya. And then there's North Korea. North Korea is a model of a country that was determined to go nuclear, that used negotiations as a means to deceive or to lull the West, and finally crossed the nuclear threshold. Now, if you were sitting in Tehran today, if you were the leader of Iran, and you looked at these two models, you looked at Gaddafi giving up his nuclear program and ending up dead, and then North Korea ending up essentially untouchable, which is the way you would want to go? And so the notion that negotiations are going to convince Iran to give up a nuclear program that has been the center point of its ambitions for the last 30 years, right at the moment when it's so close, and to say, okay, we're going to go the route of Gaddafi. That looks like a good option for us, I think is an example of a willful naivete that so much of the West has adopted, and which frankly, from where I sit in Jerusalem, is inexplicable.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.